Winter 1880. Wyoming high country, where the line between living and dying was nothing but a gust of wind. The stagecoach snapped like a dry bone and went over. When it stopped, Eva pulled herself over the embankment edge, cheekbone bleeding, hands shaking from cold, not fear. A rope had come out of the white, nothing, and she'd grabbed it without thinking. He was already there, still, enormous, eyes pale gray like sky before it clears. Eva Mercer? She straightened up. That's me, Gideon Blackwood, he said. Your husband. On paper, anyway. She came west to start over. Nobody told her surviving the frontier came first. This is Eva's story, and it starts right now. The storm hit without mercy. One moment, the stagecoach was grinding forward through knee-deep snow, the horses screaming and slipping on the frozen trail. The next, the world tilted sideways. Eva Mercer grabbed the leather strap above the window and held on. The other passenger, a portly land surveyor, who'd spent 3 hours bragging about his government contracts, slid hard into her shoulder. His whiskey flask flew somewhere into the darkness. Hold steady, the driver bellowed from above. Nobody held steady. There was nothing to hold. The left rear wheel caught the edge of the embankment. Eva felt it before she heard it, a lurch deep in her stomach, like the floor dropping out from under a dream. Then the crack of splintering wood tore through the howling wind, sharp as a rifle shot, and the stagecoach went over. She didn't scream. There wasn't time. The world rolled. Glass shattered. The surveyor's elbow connected with her cheekbone. Cold air rushed in from everywhere at once, biting and absolute, and then the carriage slammed into the side of the slope and skidded, dragging and spinning, down toward the canyon below. Eva pressed herself into the corner of the cab and covered her head with her arms. Ice and splinters rained down on her back. The horses were shrieking that terrible high sound that no person who hears it ever fully forgets, and the whole structure groaned like a living thing that knew it was dying. It stopped. Just like that. Stillness. For one long second, Eva didn't move. She listened to her own breathing, fast and ragged. She took stock, fingers, toes, the dull throb above her left eye, where she'd caught something wooden on the way down. Nothing broken. She'd gotten lucky, and she knew it. The surveyor was groaning somewhere beneath her. Alive, then. She pushed herself upright. The carriage had wedged itself against a granite outcropping, no more than 20 feet above the canyon floor. Below that, she could hear it, not see it. The river running fast and dark beneath a skin of winter ice. The wind was violent. It came in waves, each one colder than the last, and it carried snow that moved sideways, nearly horizontal, like the sky itself had turned against her. Eva had grown up in Baltimore. She'd seen nor'easters roll up the coast, had walked to school in sleet bad enough to make sensible people stay home. She had never, in 28 years of living, felt cold like this. This was a different category of cold, the kind that didn't just touch your skin, the kind that wanted in. She pulled her wool coat tighter and looked at the door above her head. The carriage was tilted at an angle, so what used to be the side was now the ceiling. She braced her feet against the seat frame and reached up. Pushed. The door resisted, swollen with ice, and she pushed harder. It gave with a groan. Wind poured in. She pulled herself up and out into the storm. The driver was already gone. Not dead, she could see boot prints in the snow, leading away from the wreck. Back up the slope. The horses were cut loose. 2 of them, scrambling up the embankment in blind panic, the third standing still, with her head low and trembling. Eva felt a surge of helpless anger at the driver, then let it go. There was no time for it. She looked down the trail, looked up, white in every direction. The narrow path they'd been traveling had vanished under the snow. There were no lanterns, no structures, no other travelers. Nothing. She was 5 days out of Cheyenne, her trunk carrying everything she owned, everything she'd salvaged from her former life in Baltimore, was somewhere inside or below the wreck. She had a small carpet bag over her shoulder with her papers, her teaching certificates, her letters from the Blackwood brothers. That was all. Eva sat on the edge of the doorframe, legs dangling into the wind, and let herself think for exactly 1 minute. She was supposed to be afraid. She understood that. She had every rational reason to be. But fear, in her experience, was only useful for about 60 seconds. After that, it was just weight you were carrying for no reason. The man in Baltimore, the one who'd fabricated the theft charge, who'd stood in her classroom doorway, with that particular smile of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, he'd expected her to be afraid, to agree, to make it easy for him. She hadn't. She'd made it very hard for him instead, and then she'd gotten on a train heading west. So 1 minute was up. She slid back down into the wreck and grabbed the surveyor by his coat lapels. "Sir, I need you to wake up and help me." He blinked at her. A cut above his eyebrow was bleeding freely, staining the snow pink where it dripped. "What in the—" "We're stuck on an embankment above a canyon in a blizzard," she said. "You can have your panic now or later, but if it's now, please do it quickly." He stared at her. "You're a schoolteacher, yes? Now get up." She was hauling him toward the door when she heard the sound. At first, she thought it was the wind changing. The storm had a voice, almost different tones as it moved through the canyon walls, through the pines on the ridge above. But this was lower, deliberate, a sharp, repeating whistle, cutting through the gale. Then she saw the rope. It came out of the white. Nothing above them, a thick braided lasso, snaking down the slope with precision, landing 3 feet from the wrecked carriage door. Eva grabbed it without thinking. It went taut immediately. Something on the other end had incredible weight behind it, or incredible strength, and she felt herself being drawn upward. She held on. The surveyor grabbed onto her coat. She didn't shake him off. They moved up the slope in lurching increments, snow spraying into her face, her boots scrabbling for purchase on the ice-slicked rock. She could feel the pull, steady and relentless. Someone up there working hand over hand without stopping, and she focused on that, just that. One handhold at a time. She cleared the embankment edge, and the wind hit her full in the face, like a wall. He was standing maybe 10 feet back from the edge, braced wide, the rope looped twice around his forearm and knotted at his belt. He was enormous, not in the exaggerated way that fear tends to make things larger, but genuinely, practically enormous, the way you'd build a man if you needed him to function in conditions exactly like these. Dark coat dusted in snow, dark hat pulled low, a jaw that could have been cut from the same granite as the outcropping that had saved the carriage. He hauled the surveyor up behind Eva without apparent effort, then dropped the rope and turned to look at her. His eyes were pale gray. She noticed that even through the snow, the kind of gray that showed up in winter sky just before it cleared. "Eva Mercer?" His voice came out low and level, barely raised, despite the wind. She pulled herself straight. Her cheekbone ached. Her hands were shaking, though she was fairly sure that was cold, and not nerves, that's me. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite. A loosening, maybe. Like a knot, releasing a single strand. "Gideon Blackwood," he said. "Your husband." On paper, anyway. She looked at him. Snow was collecting on her eyelashes. "You came out in this storm. Stage was 2 hours late." He pulled a second length of rope from his coat and looped it around his body, checking the knot with automatic practiced hands. Wasn't hard to figure. Behind him, 2 horses appeared out of the storm, massive animals, dark against the white, saddled and blanketed. A younger man held their reins, squinting against the wind. He had a gentler face than Gideon, but the same solid build, the same quality of stillness. Gideon turned back to her. He reached out and caught the carpet bag strap that was sliding off her shoulder, steadied it without comment. His hand was bared despite the cold. She could see a scar running across the back of it, thin and pale and old. "There are 3 of us," he said. "My brothers. I want you to know that before we go further." Eva looked at him for a moment. The wind screamed between them. The storm wasn't letting up, it was getting worse. The light fading fast as the afternoon collapsed into early dark. Her trunk was lost. The stagecoach was gone. She was standing on a frozen mountainside in Wyoming territory with a stranger who had just pulled her out of a canyon. She had a choice to make. She'd made harder ones. "Then I suppose," she said, "we'd better get out of this storm." Gideon Blackwood looked at her, and this time it was a smile. He turned toward the horses. "Come on then, Miss Mercer. Cabin's 2 miles up." She followed him into the white. The cabin appeared out of the dark, like a held breath finally released. Eva saw the light first amber and warm, pressing through the gaps in the shuttered windows, spilling a pale gold rectangle across the snow in front of the door. After 2 miles of riding through a storm that had stopped being dramatic and started being genuinely dangerous, that light was the most beautiful thing she'd seen in months, maybe longer. Gideon pulled his horse up in front of the structure and swung down in one clean motion, landing soundless in the snow. He reached up for Eva without ceremony, hands at her waist, and lifted her down before she could negotiate the stirrup herself. Her legs were half numb. She stumbled slightly when her boots hit the ground. He steadied her, kept his hands there for one moment, until she had her footing, then stepped back. The surveyor, who had given his name as Mr. Gerald Finch, and had spoken exactly 11 words, since the embankment was helped down by the younger brother, Caleb. Caleb had a quietness about him that Eva had noticed on the ride up. He didn't fill silence with noise. He watched things. When her grip on the reins had slipped in the cold, he'd moved his horse closer without being asked. Close enough that she could have grabbed the pommel of his saddle if she needed it. She hadn't needed to, but she noticed. The third brother, she'd caught the name Julian before the wind swallowed it, tied the horses under a lean-to at the side of the cabin and disappeared into a small outbuilding with what looked like feed buckets. Gideon opened the cabin door and stood aside. Eva walked in. The heat hit her like a physical thing. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, stacked with pine logs burning low and even, and the smell pine resin, wood smoke, something savory simmering in a covered pot, landed somewhere in her chest and made her eyes sting for reasons she was not prepared to examine. She'd been on the move for 19 days. She'd slept in rail cars and way stations and one truly grim boarding house in Cheyenne, where the lock on her door didn't work, and she'd pushed the dresser against it. She hadn't realized how tired she was until she stepped into somewhere warm. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside. One main room with the fireplace, a heavy table with 4 chairs, shelves lined with books and tools and glass jars, a kitchen area with iron pots hanging from a rack. Pelts on the walls practical, not decorative, she suspected, given the cold. Off to one side, a narrow hallway leading to what she assumed were sleeping quarters. Everything was built solid. Everything was built to last. Caleb came in behind her, shaking snow from his coat. He went directly to the fireplace, added 2 logs without disrupting the burn, then crossed to the pot and lifted the lid. Steam rose. He reached for a spoon. "Sit down," he said. Not a command, more of an invitation that trusted she'd take it. She sat. Gideon hung his coat and hat on a row of iron hooks near the door. In the firelight, Eva got her first real look at him. The storm had reduced everything to shapes and function. Here she could see the details. A scar that started near his left temple and traced down across his cheekbone, old and healed, but present. A heaviness around his eyes that didn't come from tiredness, it came from time. From years of watching things unfold that couldn't be undone. His hands were scarred too, both of them. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned. Somewhere along the way, that unnecessary motion was a liability. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I owe you an explanation," he said. Eva folded her hands on the table. "You do." Julian came in then, stomping snow from his boots. He was the youngest, she could tell by the fewer lines on his face, the quickness in his expression. But there was something else there, too, a guardedness behind his eyes that looked older than his years. He peeled off his coat, hung it up, and turned to look at her with open curiosity, and no pretense of hiding it. "She made it," he said. "She made it," Caleb confirmed, ladling something into a bowl. Julian pulled out a chair at the end of the table and sat sideways in it, legs over the arm, easy and informal. He had ink stains on 2 of his fingers. Eva noticed because she was a teacher, and ink stains were something she knew well. Gideon looked at her. "The arrangement you answered. We placed that ad together. The 3 of us. Most agencies wouldn't take the listing once we explained the situation. The woman who handled it in Baltimore told us we were decent men, despite unusual circumstances." He paused. "She didn't tell you there were 3 of us?" "No," Eva said. "She did not. We told her to explain it. She wrote 1 letter. She said I'd be marrying into the Blackwood family." Eva looked at each of them in turn. "I assumed that meant 1 Blackwood." A silence sat between them. The fire cracked. "You can leave," Gideon said. It came out without hesitation, which told her he'd decided to say it before she arrived. "Come spring, when the trail clears, we'll give you supplies, a horse and passage money to wherever you choose to go. No obligation, no contract. And in the meantime," he reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table between them. A key. Simple iron, worn smooth from handling. "Your bedroom is at the end of the hall," he said. "That's the key. You are a wife on paper, but under this roof, your freedom belongs entirely to you." Eva looked at the key. She'd expected a great many things from this journey west. She'd expected hard work and hard weather and an adjustment period that would require everything she had. She'd expected a stranger's home and a stranger's habits and the particular difficulty of learning to trust people you didn't choose. She had not expected this. A key placed on a table by a man who'd just ridden through a blizzard to find her, offered without condition. She picked it up. "I'm not leaving," she said. Caleb set a bowl in front of her. Venison stew, thick with root vegetables, still steaming. He set a piece of bread beside it and a cup of something hot that smelled like black tea. "Eat first," he said. "Everything else can wait." She ate. It was the best meal she'd had in 3 weeks, and she didn't say so because she was fairly sure she'd cry, and she'd already decided she wasn't going to do that tonight. Julian watched her with that open curiosity. "What did you teach?" "In Baltimore?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic, history." She wrapped both hands around the teacup. "I had 31 students this past year. Youngest was 5. Oldest was 14. And already taller than me, which he reminded me of frequently." Julian smiled at that. It changed his face considerably. "We have children in this area who've never seen the inside of a schoolroom," he said. "There's a boy, Tommy Ray, 8 years old. Gideon found him in an abandoned claim camp last fall. He's been here since. He's a good boy, Caleb," said from the kitchen. "Stubborn. Smart when he wants to be." "Sounds familiar," Julian said, glancing at Gideon. Gideon ignored this with the practiced ease of a man who'd been ignoring Julian for some time. After dinner, Caleb spoke quietly to Eva and asked if her feet were all right. On the ride up, he'd noticed her pressing them differently against the stirrups compensation for numbness, he explained, which could become a problem fast in temperatures like tonight's. She'd told him they were fine. He'd nodded and not pushed it. Now he brought a wide wooden basin and set it near the fire. He filled it with warm water, not hot. He was careful about that. Warm enough to bring blood back gradually, and looked at her. "May I?" he asked. "Just that? Nothing more." She thought about it for exactly 1 second. Then she pulled off her boots. Caleb sat on a low stool by the basin and gently submerged her feet, checking each one methodically. His hands were steady. He had the focused attention of someone who'd done this before, who understood what he was looking at. 1 toe on her left foot had gone a waxy, pale color that concerned him visibly. Though he didn't alarm her with it, he simply kept his hands around it, maintaining warmth, watching it until the color came back, he explained as he worked. What frostbite actually did to tissue. Why you never rubbed it, never applied direct heat. Why gradual warming was the only safe method. He said it all matter-of-factly, like he was simply talking, and Eva listened because she'd always believed that knowing things was better than not knowing them, regardless of the subject. You learned this from a doctor? She asked. Learned it from watching people die when doctors did it wrong, he said. Then, after a moment, taught myself the right way after. Across the room, Julian had retrieved a sketchbook from a shelf. He sat in the chair, nearest the fire, book in his lap, and drew. He wasn't subtle about the fact that he was drawing her. He wasn't trying to hide it, but there was nothing intrusive in it either. He wasn't staring, wasn't making her an object. He was just recording something he found worth recording. She caught his eye once. He raised his brows slightly. A question. She shrugged, which he apparently took as permission because he went back to his sketch with a small nod of thanks. Gideon sat at the table with a surveyor's map spread open in front of him, marking something with a pencil. He'd barely spoken since dinner. He didn't seem uncomfortable with the quiet. He seemed to live inside it naturally, the way some people lived inside noise. Eva sat by the fire with her feet in warm water and looked at the three of them. She was a practical woman. She believed in evidence, and the evidence in this room, the key in her pocket, the bowl they'd fed her, the careful hands around her frostbitten foot, the sketchbook, the map, the stew that was still warm in her stomach, said something that the words of most men she'd known had never managed to say. She didn't understand it yet. She wasn't going to pretend she did, but she stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Just for tonight, she let herself sit in the warmth and breathe without calculating the exit. Later, Gideon walked her to her room. He lit the lamp inside the door, checked the window latch without being asked, and turned to go. Gideon, she stopped him. Thank you for coming out tonight. He looked at her over his shoulder. That same loosening she'd seen on the mountain, barely perceptible. Sleep, he said. Storm will be gone by morning. He pulled the door closed behind him. Eva turned the key in the lock. She stood in the center of the small room, clean, sparse, a bed with heavy quilts, a nightstand with a pitcher of water, and breathed. Outside, the wind howled. The cabin walls held. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in 19 days, she didn't push the dresser against the door. She lay down with her coat over the quilts, still half-dressed, and was asleep before the lamp burned out. The snow stopped before dawn and left the world made new. Eva woke to stillness and pale light coming in around the window shutter and the distant sound of an axe splitting wood in a steady rhythm. She lay still for a moment, listening. Then she got up, splashed her face with water from the pitcher cold, but not unbearably so, and went to the window. The mountain was white and immense and absolute. Pine trees stood loaded with snow, bowing slightly under the weight. The sky above them had gone that particular winter blue that only happens when cold air is perfectly clear, so deep it almost looked wrong, like someone had painted it in, and, below the window, about 40 yards out, Gideon was splitting wood. He worked without a shirt. Eva observed this for exactly as long as it took her to absorb the information, the dense muscle of his shoulders, the steam rising from his skin in the cold air, the scar across his ribs that she hadn't seen last night. And then she went to find the kitchen. Caleb was already there. He had coffee going, real coffee, and he looked up when she appeared and said, "Morning," with the straightforward ease of someone who didn't find her presence surprising or complicated. He poured a cup and set it at the table. She sat down and picked it up with both hands. "You slept," he said. Not a question. She paused. "Where's Julian?" Caleb nodded toward a door at the back of the kitchen. "He keeps odd hours. Up until 2, then sleeps until 9. We've stopped fighting it." As if summoned, the door opened and Julian appeared. Hair in disarray, wearing a shirt that was buttoned wrong by one hole. He looked at the coffee pot with focused intent, poured himself a cup, sat down, and only then seemed to register Eva's presence. "Good morning," he said. "Your shirt?" She looked down. Looked back up at her. "Intentional," he said. She didn't believe him, but she let it go. Tommy Ray arrived 40 minutes later. He came in without knocking, which clearly required no comment from anyone in the room, shrugged off a coat 3 sizes too large for him, and stopped when he saw Eva. He was small for 8, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with a smear of something that might have been pine pitch on his left cheek. He looked at Eva with the particular wariness of a child who has learned not to be enthusiastic about new things until he understands them better. "That's her," he said to Caleb. "That's her," Caleb confirmed. "She's smaller than I thought, Tommy," Julian said. "I'm just saying." Eva set down her coffee cup and looked at Tommy directly. "I'm Eva. I hear you've been living here a while." He assessed her. "Since October. Can you read?" The wariness sharpened into something defensive. "Some. How much is some?" He glanced at Caleb, who gave him nothing in either direction. "Letters," Tommy said, "and some words." "Good," Eva said. "That's a start. What do you want to learn?" He blinked. Nobody had apparently asked him that before. "I don't know. Think about it. We've got time." She picked up her coffee again. "The storm's not going anywhere." Tommy thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "How to keep people from cheating me." Julian made a sound into his cup. "Arithmetic," Eva said. "Good choice. That was how it started." The freeze lasted 2 more weeks. The snow came again on the 3rd day, not a storm, just steady and quiet, piling silently against the windows, and the trail down to the valley became impassable. The 4 of them, plus Tommy, existed in the close quarters of the cabin through the short, pale days and the long, dark evenings, and Eva discovered that proximity either destroys people or builds them into something they couldn't have become apart. She taught Tommy at the table every morning. She borrowed a ledger from Julian's bookkeeping supplies and used the blank pages to practice letters, numbers, simple sums. Tommy was quick, genuinely. Naturally quick, though he worked hard to hide it at first, as though being seen to learn too fast might mean someone expected more of him. Eva recognized it immediately. She'd taught 31 children. She knew what it looked like when a child had been told that being smart was dangerous. She didn't make a project of him. She just kept showing up every morning and opening the ledger. By the end of the first week, he was doing 2-digit addition. By the end of the second, he'd taught himself to write his full name, Thomas Elias Ray, and had done it on a piece of paper that he folded carefully and put in his coat pocket. Eva pretended not to notice. Some things mattered more if no one made a fuss over them. The brothers worked around her lessons. Gideon came in from outside during the morning hours and went to his maps or his maintenance. There was always something needing repair in a mountain cabin in winter. And he worked quietly, at a distance, occasionally pausing to listen to what Eva was explaining. He never commented on it. He just listened, the way people listen to music they've decided they like. Caleb kept finding small opportunities to explain things, not because he was performing competence, just because that was his nature. He saw something that connected to something else and said so. One afternoon, he came in from checking the horses and told Eva about the difference in how cold affected working animals versus draft animals. She asked questions. He answered them. They ended up at the table for an hour, with Caleb drawing a rough diagram of a horse's circulatory system on a piece of paper that Tommy then stole to use the back of. Julian drew constantly, portraits mainly. The cabin walls had none of the usual hunting trophies instead. There were small framed charcoal sketches, and Eva realized gradually that they were people Julian knew. A woman with gray-streaked hair and a direct gaze. A man with a blacksmith's forearms sitting outside what might have been a market stall. Children in various states of motion. She asked him about them one evening when the fire was low and Gideon and Caleb were out checking the perimeter. Julian was quiet for a moment. "I studied in New York for 2 years," he said. "Painting, illustration. I was getting work, good work." A gallery in the city was interested. She waited. The owner decided I wasn't the right kind of person. He looked at the sketch in his hands, then back at the fire. He used different words, but that was the meaning. I didn't come from the right family, didn't have the right connections, hadn't been educated at the right institution. A pause. Said my talent was untamed, like that was an insult. "What did you do?" came back west. He shrugged, but it wasn't indifferent. They get to decide what hangs on the walls of their galleries. They don't get to decide what I draw. Eva thought about that for a moment, about a man in Baltimore, with a wide office and a city seal on his door, who had decided she was an object rather than a person, and had used the law to punish her for disagreeing. She thought about what it cost to walk away from everything you'd built, and whether walking away was actually a kind of fighting back. Their loss, she said. Julian looked at her sideways. You didn't even see my work. I don't need to. He was quiet for a second. Then he smiled the full version, not the partial one he deployed most of the time. Fair enough. The argument happened in the second week, on a night when the temperature dropped sharply enough to make the cabin walls pop and groan. Eva had been pushing Tommy. Through multiplication tables, she'd started them early, past what most people would think appropriate for an 8-year-old, because Tommy was ready and waiting for her to notice, and Gideon had come in to refill his coffee and stood watching. After Tommy went to bed, Gideon said, You're pushing him fast. He can handle it, Eva said. He's had enough things pushed on him. She turned around. I'm not pushing hardship on him. I'm pushing math. She kept her voice level. There's a difference between demanding too much and expecting enough. Tommy's been told his whole life not to expect anything. I'm trying to correct that. Gideon looked at her, a long look. I'm not arguing you're wrong, he said finally. Then what are you doing? Making sure you know him. Not just the potential, him. Eva held his gaze. I know him. I've been sitting with him for 6 hours a day for 10 days. She paused. I know he's scared. I know he thinks caring about something means losing it. I know he'd rather pretend he learned the wrong answer than admit he got it right on the first try. She paused. Again, I'm working on all of it. Not just the multiplication. Gideon was quiet. Then he picked up his coffee cup and went back to his chair. She thought that was the end of it. Then he said, from across the room, he told Caleb this morning that you were the first teacher who didn't make him feel stupid. Eva looked at her hands. She said, All right, he agreed. 3 days later, on a bright morning, when the temperature had risen, just enough to make the snow on the roof slide off in long, slow sheets, Julian showed her the sketch he'd done the night she arrived. She was in it, recognizable but not literal. The way good portraiture works. She was looking at something off the page, and whatever she was looking at, the Eva in the drawing wasn't afraid of it. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. Why did you come, really? The agency said most women who answer those listings are running toward something, but you weren't. He said it without accusation, just observation. You were running away from something, I could tell. When you came in that first night, Eva considered lying. It would have been easy. She'd had practice. A man in Baltimore, she said, an official. He wanted something from me, and I said no. So he manufactured a theft charge to give himself leverage. She looked at Julian straight. I left before he could use it. Julian absorbed this. He's still back there. He is? That doesn't scare you? The idea that it's not resolved? Eva thought about it honestly. It terrifies me, she said, but staying would have been worse. Julian nodded slowly. He rolled up the sketch and held it out to her. She took it. One afternoon, when Caleb was pulling a thorn from Gideon's palm, an occupational hazard of unknown origin that neither of them explained, Eva sat across the table and asked the question she'd been carrying for 2 weeks. Why didn't you each find your own wife? Separately. Gideon and Caleb looked at each other. Not the kind of look that means they're hiding something. The kind that means this question deserves a real answer and they're deciding who gives it. Gideon gave it. Back east, he said, men buy women with gold and treat them like property. He turned his hand over so Caleb could see the thorn better. On this mountain, we share the weight to protect the woman we love. A pause. Human beings aren't livestock, and no man owns another. Eva looked at him for a long moment. That's not an answer about why you didn't find separate wives. Yes, it is, Gideon said. You just have to think about it. She thought about it. And then, slowly, she understood. It wasn't about the arrangement. It was about what they believed the arrangement should be, what any arrangement between people should be. Not ownership, not transaction. Something built on choosing and being chosen, freely, on ground where everybody carried part of the weight. She'd come here running from a man who believed the opposite, so completely he'd built a legal case around it. She looked at the three of them, Gideon, extending his scarred hand patiently, Caleb working with focused precision, Julian somewhere behind her, sketching something in the margin of his ledger, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe. Not rescued, not dependent, just safe, the way you are, when you've found people who understand the difference. Outside, the snow was melting off the roof, in slow rivers. Somewhere in the valley below, spring was beginning to think about arriving. Tommy came in from feeding the horses, stomped his boots, looked at all of them, and said, "What's for supper?" The tension in the room broke into something warmer. Caleb laughed. Julian suggested. Tommy learned to cook as his next lesson. Tommy looked at Eva. "Is that arithmetic?" he asked. "Ingredients?" she said. "Absolutely." He thought about it. "Fine," he said. "But I'm not cleaning up." The baby came early. Not dangerously early. Caleb had been tracking Martha Holt's pregnancy for 3 months, riding the 4 miles to the Holt claim every 2 weeks, checking the position, checking Martha's blood pressure, with a method he'd read about in a medical journal he'd ordered from St. Louis and reread so many times the binding had split. He'd told her to expect the baby in late April. The baby arrived on a Thursday evening in late March during a rainstorm that drummed against the cabin roof in steady, relentless sheets. Eva had gone with Caleb that morning on a routine visit. She'd been going with him for 3 weeks by then, partly because Martha Holt was 22 and frightened and seemed steadier when another woman was in the room, and partly because Eva found the work absorbing in a way she hadn't expected. She'd grown up around illness. Her mother had kept a sharp, practical household, and Eva had learned early that being useful in a crisis mattered more than squeamishness. What she hadn't expected was Caleb. She'd watched him for months now. In the cabin, he was quiet, methodical, easy to underestimate. Out here, working, he was something else. He spoke to Martha like she was intelligent, like her own body was something she deserved to understand and not just endure. He explained what he was doing before he did it. He told her why. He washed his hands every time, before touching anything, with the carbolic soap he carried in his kit, and he'd asked Eva to do the same when she assisted, and when she asked why, he'd laid out the entire theory of antisepsis with the focused clarity of someone who had rebuilt his understanding of medicine from the ground up after watching people die from infections that never should have happened. "Most frontier doctors won't touch that theory," Eva said, drying her hands on a clean cloth the way he'd shown her. "Most frontier doctors learned what they know from other frontier doctors," Caleb said. "The information loops back on itself. Nobody questions it, because nobody's reading what's coming out of Europe." He checked his instruments. "People die from that." "People died from that," Eva said, "and you changed how you work. What else would you do?" She didn't answer. She thought about 31 students in a Baltimore classroom and a curriculum she'd fought the school board to update for 3 straight years, citing evidence and being told that new methods created unnecessary disruption. She understood what he meant. The labor lasted 6 hours. Caleb directed and Eva assisted, and Martha Holt gripped Eva's hand with a strength that left bruises on 2 of her fingers. And the rain kept coming, and at 9:47 in the evening, a boy arrived in the world, making his opinions loudly known. Caleb tied and cut the cord with clean instruments, handed the baby to Eva, turned back to Martha. Thorough, he checked everything twice. He explained what he was doing to Martha, even while she was exhausted, because he believed people had a right to know what was being done to their own bodies. Eva held the baby. He was red and furious and alive, and she looked at his small, complete, furious face, and felt something enormous and inarticulable move through her. They rode back in the dark, rain still falling, but lighter now. Eva was tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone, the physical tiredness of 6 hours of intense, focused work. And beside her, Caleb was quiet in the particular way he went quiet after medical work. Processing, reviewing, making sure he hadn't missed anything. "You did well," he said somewhere on the trail. "I mostly held her hand and passed you things." "That's not true." A pause. "You kept her focused when the pain was worst. Talked her through it. Kept her breathing even." He glanced over. "That's not nothing. That's actually the harder part." Eva looked at the trail ahead. The rain was tapering to mist. Through the trees, she could see the cabin lights. "That boy," she said, "he's going to grow up out here." "He is. I want to teach him someday. When he's ready." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "You will." They got back to the cabin past 11. Gideon had left a lamp burning in the window he always did, when any of them were out after dark, and the fire inside was stoked, and the coffee pot was warm. Gideon was awake at the table, not waiting with visible concern, just awake. He looked up when they came in. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "Boy," Caleb said. "Both fine," Gideon nodded. He looked at Eva, looked at her more carefully, something assessing in it. "Go sit down," he said. She didn't argue. Julian was awake, too, reading by the fire, and he looked up and read the evening off their faces in about 4 seconds. He closed his book and went to pour something into 2 cups, not coffee. Something darker, something with warmth in it, and brought them over without comment. Eva sat in the chair nearest the fire and let the heat work on her. She didn't speak for a while. None of them pushed her to. The rain on the roof had settled into a low, even percussion, and the fire snapped and breathed, and gradually the tension of the evening began to leave her body the way tension always does when you finally give it permission. She looked at the 3 of them, Gideon, at the table, chin in his hand now, watching her with that gray, steady gaze. Caleb, leaning against the kitchen doorframe, cup in hand, the lines around his eyes, softer than they'd been in the cold. Julian in the firelight, the glow of it across his face, watching her with the open attentiveness he never tried to conceal. It had been months since she'd come off that mountain in a storm, and Gideon had put a key in her hand and called her free. Months of mornings and suppers and long evenings by the fire. Months of learning each of them the shape of their silences, the things they reached for when they were worried, the particular way each of them moved through the world. She knew Gideon checked the window latches before he went to bed every night, always the same order. She knew Caleb kept a running list in his head of every patient he'd ever treated, and reviewed it sometimes in the evenings like a man checking his own accounts. She knew Julian drew when he couldn't say something, that the sketchbook was his other language, more honest than words. She knew them. That was the thing. She'd come here a stranger, and somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being one. She looked into the fire. Then she stood up. She carried her cup down the hall. She stopped at her bedroom door, and she turned around. They were all watching her, not with expectation, not with pressure, just watching the 3 of them the way the fire watched, present and warm, and waiting for her to decide what she wanted. "Come in," she said. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Gideon stood up from the table. He moved down the hall, unhurried, no performance in it, just certain. He stepped close to her in the doorway, close enough that she could smell him leather and wood smoke, and the cold that still clung to his coat from checking the horses earlier, and his voice came out low, unhurried. "Look at us," he said. "We don't bite unless..." Julian appeared at his shoulder, and he leaned in close to her ear, his voice barely above a whisper. "Unless you beg us to." Eva gasped. It came out before she could manage it, heat moving up the back of her neck and into her face, not from embarrassment, from the simple, overwhelming reality of this moment, of 3 men who had spent months protecting her choice, looking at her right now, like her choice was the only thing in the room. She stepped back into the bedroom. They followed. The rain kept drumming on the roof. The lamp on the nightstand threw gold light across the walls and across all 4 of them, 4 people with histories full of wounds, full of the specific damage that loneliness and rejection and fear leave behind, coming together in a small, warm room in the middle of a Wyoming mountain while the storm played out above them. Gideon moved with a slowness that was deliberate, not hesitation, but care. He reached up and touched her face with one scarred hand, and Eva turned into it without deciding to. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, the same cheekbone she'd caught against something in the crash months ago, and his eyes asked a question. His voice didn't need to. She answered it by closing the distance. Caleb was different. Where Gideon was commanding, Caleb was attentive. He paid attention in a crisis, and this was no different, watching her face, watching what moved through it, responsive in a way that felt almost like a conversation. 2 people figuring out a language together as they went. He had healer's hands. She'd known that for months. She just hadn't known what it felt like when he turned all that focused attention entirely on her. Julian undid her hair. He did it like he was unwrapping something he'd been thinking about drawing for a long time, careful, unhurried, watching the dark weight of it fall past her shoulders with an expression of open, uncomplicated delight. He was the most openly emotional of the 3, the one most willing to let her see what he felt, and what he felt was written clearly on his face. They were gentle with her, all 3 of them. Not tentative, there was nothing tentative about any part of this night, but gentle in the way that comes from people who have thought seriously about another person's experience, who understand that gentleness isn't weakness, it's precision. And Eva, for the first time in longer than she could calculate, let herself be. She'd spent 2 years in Baltimore being careful, careful with her words, her movements, her expressions, always aware of being watched by a man who'd decided she was something to be acquired. She'd come west, tightly wound, carrying Baltimore's weight like a pack. She hadn't noticed she couldn't set down. She set it down. What happened in that room wasn't a transaction, and it wasn't a surrender. It was 4 people choosing freely, with full knowledge of each other, to dismantle the particular walls that years of hurt had built inside each of them. Gideon's walls built from war and loss and the cold weight of being responsible for everything. Caleb's walls built from grief, from patience he'd failed before he'd learned what he needed to know. Julian's walls built from rejection, from being told his particular way of seeing the world had no value to the people who decided such things, and Eva's walls. They came down in the firelight and the rain. Afterward, they lay together in the dark, listening to the storm. Eva was in the middle, and the warmth of them on either side of her was so total and complete that she couldn't locate the edges of herself clearly, couldn't find where she stopped and where the room began. Gideon's hand found hers in the dark. He didn't squeeze it, just held it, palm to palm. She stared at the ceiling. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out by itself. Nobody answered immediately. Then Julian said, from somewhere near her left shoulder, "Of us?" "Of anything," she said. Another silence. "Good," Gideon said. She was asleep in minutes. The last thing she heard was the rain tapering off, the storm finally spent, and somewhere above the thinning clouds, the first birds beginning, tentative and new, to test the dark with sound. Spring arrived the way it always did in Wyoming, not all at once, but in arguments with itself, 3 warm days followed by one brutal cold one, the snow retreating up the slopes grudgingly, wildflowers pushing through mud that was still frozen 2 inches down. By April, the trail to Oak Haven was passable. The town was 8 miles southeast, settled in a valley where 2 creeks met, and it had grown enough in the last 5 years to have a proper main street, a telegraph office, a general store, a hotel with 6 rooms, and a mayor who'd been in office for 4 years and showed every sign of intending to remain so indefinitely. Eva had heard the name Harrison Drake mentioned once or twice in passing. Gideon had said it with the flat tone he reserved for things that required careful handling, and left it at that. She hadn't pressed. The trip to Oak Haven was Julian's idea, practically speaking. He'd been corresponding with the county land office about establishing an official school registry. Any school operating with public funds needed to be on record, and they'd agreed months ago that formalizing Eva's teaching, getting it recognized, was the right move. Tommy was one child. There were others in the valley who needed what Eva could give them. Making it official would allow them to apply for books, slates, materials. It mattered. Eva dressed carefully that morning. Her trunk had been retrieved in pieces from the ravine Julian and Caleb had gone down in February, when the ice was stable enough, and most of what survived was practical. But she had one good dress, dark blue wool, and she put it on with the understanding that appearing in a government office required a certain presentation. She'd learned that in Baltimore. The way you looked in those rooms told people how seriously to take you before you'd said a single word, which was unfair and also true. Gideon looked at her when she came out and said nothing, but he held the door. They rode in together, the four of them, with Tommy, left in the care of the Holt family. Down the valley he'd complained bitterly, and Eva had told him they'd bring him a peppermint stick from the general store, which had quieted him with undignified speed. Oakhaven was busier than Eva had expected. The spring market brought people in from the surrounding territory, ranchers, farmers, trappers, families who'd gone all winter without seeing another face outside their own households. The main street was thick with horses and wagons, with voices and the smell of animals and wood smoke, and the sweet sharp scent of fresh-cut pine from the lumber wagon parked outside the general store. Eva walked beside Julian toward the land office, which was at the far end of the main street, while Gideon and Caleb went to the general store for supplies. The sun was out properly for the first time in weeks, and it caught the mud on the street and turned it almost gold. She was explaining to Julian how she intended to phrase the school registry application. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, specifically about the language. What would make a frontier county clerk take it seriously when Julian stopped walking? She noticed because she'd grown attuned to his small signals. He didn't grab her arm or make a sound. He just stopped. She stopped too, looked at him. His face had changed. The lightness that had been in it all morning was gone. He was looking past her, down the street, and his jaw had gone tight. She turned around. The man arrived on a black horse, surrounded by 10 deputies arranged in a formation that was clearly not accidental. They rode down the center of Oakhaven's main street, slowly, people clearing out of their way, without being told to. With the practiced ease of a crowd that had learned clearing was the better option. Mayor Harrison Drake was not what Ava had expected from a frontier politician. He was polished, that was the first word her mind produced. Well-dressed in a dark suit, with a silver watch chain, silver-haired and well-fed, with a face that would have read as distinguished if you didn't look at the eyes. The eyes were the problem. They moved across the crowd with an inventory quality, cataloging, assessing, sorting people into categories of useful and inconvenient. They landed on Eva and stayed. Julian said quietly, "Eva, go inside." "No," she said, and said, "Eva, I'm not running from a man on a pub street in broad daylight," she said. She kept her voice steady. She could feel her heart in her throat, but she kept her voice steady. She'd had practice. Drake pulled his horse up 10 feet from where they stood. His deputies fanned out behind him. The crowd on the street had gone very quiet. He looked at Eva for a long moment. Then, with a performance of courtesy that didn't reach any part of his face, he touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Or is it Mrs. Blackwood now?" Eva said nothing. "A long way from Baltimore," he said, though I imagine that was rather the point. Gideon's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. He moved quietly for a large man when he needed to. "Drake," he said, "just the name, nothing attached to it." Drake's gaze shifted. A microscopic calculation happened behind his eyes. "Blackwood," he said, "I'm going to need you to step aside." "On what grounds?" Drake reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He opened it with the unhurried precision of a man who has been waiting to use this particular piece of paper for some time. "Federal warrant," he said, "for one Evangeline Mercer, late of Baltimore, Maryland, charged with grand larceny and attempted murder." He looked back at Eva. "The city of Baltimore sends its regards." The street was completely silent now. Eva felt the words hit her like cold water. Grand larceny, she'd expected. That was the original fabricated charge, the leverage he'd built before she left. Attempted murder was new. Her mind moved fast and clinical through what it meant he'd escalated, which meant he'd been embarrassed by her leaving, which meant the warrant was personal on top of being manufactured, which meant it was also more dangerous. He heard Caleb's voice, low and controlled, from somewhere to her right. "That warrant is based on false information." "That's for a court to determine," Drake said, pleasantly. "The court it was filed in," Caleb said, "is in your jurisdiction. Also for a higher court to determine." Drake folded the paper. "In the meantime, the warrant is valid, and I am authorized to execute it." Gideon stepped forward. He moved between Eva and Drake's horse, and the movement was so absolute and unhurried that three of the deputies instinctively shifted their hands toward their holsters. Gideon didn't look at the deputies. He looked at Drake. "You're not taking her," he said. Drake looked down at him from the horse. Something moved behind his eyes. He didn't fear Gideon. Eva could see that. What he felt was something colder and more calculated. "He was measuring Blackwood," he said. "I have 10 armed men. You have 2 brothers and a schoolteacher." A pause. "Stand aside, no." The sound of the shot was enormous in the quiet street. Eva didn't understand what had happened for one full second. She saw Gideon's body jerk. She saw his right hand go to his chest. She saw the dark bloom spreading through his shirt with a speed that was terrifying in its straightforwardness. Blood moving fast. Too fast. Soaking through the fabric. Then the sound caught up with her and she understood. One of the deputies had fired. She couldn't see which one. It didn't matter. Gideon went down to one knee. He put his left hand in the snow to keep himself upright. He looked up at her, and she could see the effort it cost him to hold his eyes focused, the immense physical effort of a man refusing to fall. "Gideon," she moved toward him. Drake's horse stepped between them. She felt iron close around her wrists. The handcuffs were heavy, much heavier than she'd expected. Cold even through the sleeves of her coat. She looked down at them with a strange, detached clarity, and then looked up at Drake, who was looking down at her with an expression of satisfaction that made her want to take the cuffs off and put them around his neck. She heard Caleb's voice and Julian's simultaneously, not words, just sound, the raw sound of 2 men watching something they couldn't stop happening. Helpless and furious and present, Gideon was still on one knee in the blood-stained snow. He was still looking at her. His gray eyes were clear, impossibly clear, for a man with a bullet in his chest. She held his gaze for as long as Drake's horse allowed. Then Drake turned the horse, and the deputies moved around her, and she was pulled forward into the crowd that parted and closed behind her like water. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, because she needed to hold herself together for what was coming next. And looking back at Gideon on the ground in his own blood would have broken something in her that she couldn't afford to have broken right now. She heard Julian shout Gideon's name. She heard Caleb steady, competent Caleb, who knew exactly what a bullet in the chest meant and exactly what to do about it. She heard him say, very clearly, "I've got him. I've got him," the voice of a man setting aside everything else and doing the one thing he could do. She held on to that voice. Drake's deputies walked her down the main street of Oakhaven with her wrists in iron and the whole town watching. And Eva Mercer kept her chin level and her back straight and her eyes forward. She had sat in a Baltimore courtroom and listened to a fabricated charge, read out with official language and official gravity. She had stood in a school hallway while a man in an expensive suit told her what was going to happen to her if she didn't cooperate. She had spent 19 days on trains and way stations running from the ghost of a legal document That didn't represent a single true thing. She knew what this was. It was the last move of a man who was running out of them. The jail was a squat stone building behind the mayor's office. Cold inside, even in spring. The walls holding winter with the particular tenacity of thick stone. She was put in a cell with an iron cot and a window too high to see anything through. The deputy who locked the door didn't look at her while he did it, which told her something about him that wasn't entirely without hope. She sat down on the cot. She thought about Gideon. She thought about Caleb's voice saying, "I've got him." She thought about Julian, who was the least likely fighter of the three, but who had looked at Drake's deputies with something in his face that she recognized, not rage, which burns out fast, but resolve, which doesn't. She thought about the legal evidence she'd collected over 4 months and stored in the lining of her carpet bag. Letters, financial records, a deposition from a Baltimore clerk who'd witnessed the original charge being fabricated and had written it all down in his own hand and sent it west because he was afraid, and also because he had a conscience. She thought about the circuit judge who came through Oakhaven every 3 months. Caleb had mentioned it once in passing. She'd filed it. She thought about everything she knew, all the tools she had, and she began to arrange them into an order of operations. Outside, somewhere back on the main street, a horse moved at speed and then was gone. She hoped it was Caleb, heading for a surgeon. She hoped it was Gideon's blood on his hands and not Gideon's death. She sat in the cold cell, and she didn't cry, and she didn't break, and she didn't give Harrison Drake the satisfaction of even one moment of visible despair. She planned. The first night in the cell was the hardest, not because of fear. Eva had gotten a handle on fear months ago, had learned to treat it like a difficult student, acknowledge it, give it a task, don't let it run the room. The hardest part was the not knowing. Gideon on the ground in the snow, Caleb's voice saying, "I've got him," and then nothing. A stone wall, a high window showing a rectangle of dark sky. She slept in pieces, woke in pieces, and by the time gray morning light came through the window, she'd arranged everything she knew into something usable. The deputy who brought her breakfast was young, maybe 20, with a face that hadn't fully settled into whatever it was going to become. He slid a tin plate through the slot in the door without speaking. Cornbread and salt pork, still warm. "What's your name?" Eva asked. He looked up, surprised she'd asked. "Daniels," he said. "How long have you worked for Mayor Drake, Deputy Daniels?" A pause. 8 months. "Do you like the work?" He looked at her for a moment, then looked away. "I'll bring water later," he said, and left. She ate the cornbread. It was decent. She filed Daniels away in her mind under people worth paying attention to. Drake came at noon. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 deputies and the particular energy of a man who has been looking forward to something. He pulled a chair from the hallway and set it outside her cell door and sat down in it, legs crossed, unhurried, a man with time. Eva sat on the cot with her hands folded in her lap and looked at him. "You look well," he said, "for someone who spent the night in a jail cell." "I've slept in worse places," she said. "The way station outside Cheyenne, for instance." Something moved behind his eyes. He hadn't expected pleasantness. "Good. I'm going to make this simple," he said. "The charges against you, both the larceny and the murder charge, carry significant sentences. In a federal court, you're looking at 10 years minimum. Possibly more, depending on the judge." Eva said nothing, however. Drake continued. "I have some influence over how these charges are characterized. Before they reach a judge, I also have influence over whether additional charges, say, harboring charge against your husbands, obstructing justice, various other inconveniences are filed or not." He smiled. It was a practice smile, the result of years of deploying it in rooms like this. "I'm a reasonable man. I'm open to arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "A signed confession, for a start. Acknowledging the theft, acknowledging the assault on my associate in Baltimore." He tilted his head, "and a relocation. Away from the Blackwood property. Away from Wyoming territory, in fact." There are opportunities in other parts of the country for a woman of your intelligence. The smile did change. You'd be under my supervision, naturally, to ensure the terms were met. The room was very quiet. Eva looked at him. She looked at him the way she used to look at the school board members who told her that updating her curriculum was unnecessary, with the particular patience of someone who has heard this argument in various forms and has a very clear response to it. No, she said. Drake's smile held, but something behind it cooled. Miss Mercer, Mrs. Blackwood, she said. On paper, the Blackwood arrangement isn't legally recognized in this territory. Is that your legal opinion, or theirs? She kept her voice conversational. Because I'd be interested in the statute you're referencing. A silence. One of the deputies shifted his weight. You're not in a position to negotiate, Drake said. The pleasantness was thinning at the edges. I'm not negotiating, Eva said. I'm declining. She looked at him steadily. You've built a case on fabricated evidence. I know it. You know it. And the two deputies standing behind you know it, even if they haven't said so out loud. She glanced at the deputies. She'd been building to this. You can lock up my body in iron, but you cannot shackle my dignity. Neither deputy moved. Are you men enforcing the law? She said, or mercenaries serving a tyrant? The word tyrant landed in the room like a stone in still water, rings moving outward. Daniels, the young one, looked at the floor. The older deputy, broad-shouldered, with a gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had been doing this job long enough to know when something was wrong, looked at Drake. Not at Eva, at Drake, and the look asked a question. Drake stood up. The pleasantness was completely gone now, replaced by something harder and colder that was closer to his actual face. You'll reconsider, he said. I won't, Eva said. He picked up his chair and walked out. The deputies followed. The door at the end of the corridor closed with a sound like punctuation. Eva let out a breath she'd been managing carefully for 10 minutes. Then she stood up and went to the window and stood on the cot frame to see out of it. She could see a slice of the main street, the edge of a building across the way, a triangle of pale spring sky, people moving, normal life proceeding on the other side of the stone wall. She thought about Gideon. She thought about Caleb's hands, which she'd watched extract a splinter from Tommy's foot with the same focused precision she imagined. He brought to everything. She thought about what a bullet in the chest required, the entry point, the path, what it might have missed or not missed. And then she stopped thinking about it, because that path led somewhere she couldn't afford to go right now. She climbed down from the cot frame and started pacing. 10 steps one way, 10 steps back. She did this for a while because movement helped her think, and she had a great deal of thinking to do. The evidence in her carpet bag was the center of it. The bag had been taken when she was brought in standard procedure and was presumably in Drake's office or in the intake room. Getting it in front of the right person was the question. The circuit judge was the answer. If she could last long enough, if someone on the outside knew to request a federal hearing rather than a local one. Julian knew. She was certain of that. Julian had been corresponding with the land office, had been learning the administrative architecture of the territory for months in the process of setting up the school registry. He understood how the system worked in a way that Gideon, who operated on instinct and physical authority, and Caleb, who operated on knowledge and precision, didn't quite. Julian understood paperwork. He understood who had power over whom and why. She was counting on that. On the second day, Daniels brought her water and lingered half a second longer than necessary. Deputy, Eva said, "Do you know who Caleb Blackwood is?" Daniels said nothing. "He's a medic," Eva said. "Self-taught, but better than most licensed physicians I've encountered. He's treated people in this valley for 2 years, free of charge, as often as not." She paused. "Has he ever treated anyone you know?" A longer pause this time. "My sister," Daniel said. "Last winter, fever." He stopped. "She was bad, and she's well now?" He looked at the floor. "Ma'am?" Eva nodded. "I'm not asking you to do anything," she said. I'm just telling you who these people are. So, you have the complete picture. Daniels picked up the empty tin from breakfast and walked out. On the third day, Drake came back, this time without deputies. He brought a folded paper and a pen and set them on the floor in front of her cell door. Confession, he said. Sign it, and this is over. Eva looked at the paper. She looked at the pen. She looked at Drake. Tell me something, she said, in Baltimore. Before I left, what did you actually think was going to happen? He looked at her. You thought I'd agree, she said. That's what I've been trying to understand. You're not a stupid man. You knew I was a teacher. You knew I had a legal education. I attended every school board meeting for 3 years. I cited statutes in public forums. It was not a secret. And yet, you thought I would simply agree to what you wanted. She tilted her head. Was it because I'm a woman? Or was it because you've never met real resistance before? Drake's jaw tightened fractionally. Both, I suspect, Eva said. Which means I'm not your first, and I'm sorry for whoever came before me, because they didn't have what I have. What's that? Witnesses, she said, documentation. And 3 extremely motivated men who know this territory better than your deputies do. Drake picked up the paper and the pen. He looked at her for a long moment. You're very confident for someone in a cage, he said. I've been free my whole life, Eva said. This is just a temporary inconvenience. He walked out. She sat back down on the cot and breathed. Her hands were shaking slightly. They always did. After those conversations, her body's delayed acknowledgement of the sustained effort of staying calm. She pressed them flat against her thighs and waited for them to stop. On the 4th day, she heard something. It was distant, and might have been anything a dispute in the street. Horses, the ordinary sounds of a frontier town, going about its business. But there was a pattern to it that didn't fit ordinary noise. A progression. Something moving through the town's edges in a way that didn't announce itself. She got up on the cot frame and looked through the high window. On the street, one of Drake's deputies was walking briskly toward the jail from the direction of the telegraph office. His face had the specific expression of someone carrying bad news they haven't yet had to deliver. 2 minutes later, she heard Drake's voice in the front room, raised, which was new. He'd been controlled every time she'd seen him. Whatever was in that telegraph had disrupted his control. She climbed down and sat on the cot and smiled at the wall. Something was moving out there. She didn't know what yet, but 3 men who knew this mountain, who knew this territory, who knew cattle traps and canyon echoes, and the particular way mountain fog moved through Devil's Pass. 3 men who had been sitting still for 4 days had decided to stop sitting still. She was sure of it. She straightened her dress. She smoothed her hair. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. Caleb extracted the bullet on the floor of the Oak Haven Hotel. There wasn't time to move Gideon further. The bullet had gone into the right side of his chest, below the collarbone, and Caleb's first assessment done on his knees in the snow of the main street, while Julian held Gideon upright, and the crowd kept a wide, silent circle, was that it had missed the lung by less than an inch, maybe less than half an inch. He'd know more when he could see properly. He told Julian what to get from the general store. He said it once, clearly, in order of priority. Julian went at a run. The hotel owner, a woman named Mrs. Greer, who had the self-possession of someone who'd been managing emergencies since before Caleb was born, took one look at the situation and cleared her ground floor room without being asked. She boiled water. She brought clean cloth. She did not ask unnecessary questions or make noise about the blood on her floor. Caleb worked for 2 hours. He kept his hands steady by keeping his mind in one place: the work, only the work. The specific mechanical problem of a bullet in a specific location in a specific body. He could not think about Eva, not yet. He could not think about Drake or the handcuffs or the expression on Gideon's face as they pulled her away. None of that was useful. None of it would help the man bleeding on the floor in front of him. The bullet came out clean. He held it up in the lamplight, small, ordinary, a piece of metal that had almost ended his brother's life, and then set it on the cloth beside him and went back to work. He cleaned the wound with carbolic solution. He packed it and bound it and explained to Mrs. Greer how to change the dressing and what to watch for if infection set in. Then he stood up, and his legs tried to give out. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands for 60 seconds. 60 seconds, exactly. He'd learned to give himself that. Then he stood up again. Julian was at the window. He'd been there since the extraction ended, watching the street, and his sketchbook was open in his hands, but he hadn't drawn anything. The pages were blank. "She's in the jail," Julian said. "Stone building behind the mayor's office. One deputy on the door." "How do you know?" "I walked past it." He turned from the window. His face was composed, but composed in the way of a man who has put considerable effort into the composing. "Daniels is the deputy. He's young. I don't think he's committed." Caleb looked at his brother. "How long before Gideon can travel?" "You tell me." Caleb thought about it honestly. 3 days minimum. Any movement before that risks the wound reopening. He paused. "The binding will hold if he doesn't push it, but Gideon's definition of not pushing it and mine have historically diverged." Julian almost smiled. "Historically. I'll talk to him." Gideon was awake when Caleb came back to him, pale and clearly in significant pain that he was managing by not mentioning it, but awake and focused with the particular intensity of a man whose mind was working hard to compensate for what his body couldn't do right now. Caleb told him about the bullet, the depth, the margin. He told him clearly and completely, because Gideon always wanted the complete picture and obscuring. It was both pointless and disrespectful. Gideon listened. 3 days, Caleb said. "You rest for 3 days, and then we talk about movement. Drake won't wait 3 days. Drake doesn't know where we are. Mrs. Greer, Drake knows everything that happens in this town. Then he knows I pulled a bullet out of your chest, and you need time to recover, which buys us some cover." Caleb kept his voice level. 3 days, Gideon." Gideon looked at the ceiling. A muscle in his jaw worked. "She's alone in there," he said. "I know, she's Eva," Caleb said. "She came off a wrecked stagecoach in a blizzard, and her first question was about getting out of the cold. She's not sitting in that cell falling apart." He paused. "She's planning something. I'd bet on it." Gideon was quiet for a moment, then something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but a version of it. He knew Eva. He'd been knowing her for months, paying the particular attention that comes from living closely with someone. And Caleb was right. She wasn't the person you worried about being broken by a cage. She was the person you worried about leaving alone with too much time to think, because she'd come out of it with a plan more organized than anything you'd managed. 3 days, Gideon said. 3 days. Julian spent those 3 days moving through Oakhaven like a man with no particular agenda. He had a gift for this appearing unhurried, appearing uninvested, sketching street scenes in his book while actually mapping every deputy's patrol route, every entry point to the jail, every useful feature of the terrain between the town's southern edge and the road that led to Devil's Pass. He also talked to people. Julian had always been the best of them at talking to people. He found them genuinely interesting, which they could tell, and which made them open in ways they might not have planned. He learned that Drake had sent a telegraph to the federal office in Cheyenne, filing the harboring charge against Gideon and Caleb. He learned that a circuit judge was scheduled to pass through the territory in approximately 2 weeks. He learned, from a conversation with the land office clerk that appeared to be entirely about school registry paperwork, that Eva's carpetbag was in Drake's personal office, not the intake room. He also learned that 3 of Drake's 10 deputies had worked for the previous mayor, had transferred their employment when Drake took office, and had never been entirely easy about the transfer. He put all of this in a letter to a lawyer in Cheyenne, whose name he'd found in the county records, a federal man with no ties to Drake's jurisdiction. He sent it on the 2nd day, paid the telegraph operator double to send it priority, and did not tell Gideon because Gideon would have asked questions that would have required energy they didn't have right now. On the morning of the third day, Gideon stood up. He stood up carefully and with obvious cost, and he stood there for a moment, getting his balance, and then he looked at Caleb and said, "Tell me the plan." Caleb told him. They left Oakhaven before first light on the fourth day, which was not quite 3 full days. And Caleb noted this and said nothing because the argument was already decided. The prison wagon carrying Drake's initial transfer of documents, and, Caleb suspected, Eva herself. If Drake had decided to move her to a more secure facility before the circuit judge arrived, was due to take the Devil's Pass Road east the following morning. That was the information Julian had extracted from the land office clerk in a conversation that had covered, ostensibly, only the matter of proper form submission for educational registry. Devil's Pass was 7 miles of narrow, ice-slick trail cut through granite walls, with a canyon floor 200 feet below, and mountain fog that moved in from the west in the early morning hours, and reduced visibility to 30 feet. It was, from a tactical standpoint, a corridor. 1 entry point, 1 exit, high walls on both sides, the fog as cover. Gideon had scouted it 3 years ago. He knew every feature. They took the horses up a back trail in the dark, Gideon riding carefully, one hand loose on the reins and the other pressed against his side out of habit. Rather than necessity, Caleb had bound him well, and the wound was holding. The mountain was quiet in that particular pre-dawn way. The birds not yet started, the air sharp and still. Caleb had his medical kit. He also had a length of rope, 2 cattle traps, and a working knowledge of how sound moved through canyon walls that he'd accumulated over 2 winters of riding these trails. Julian had his sketchbook and a rifle he could use adequately, and preferred not to. Gideon had a plan. "We're not here to kill anyone," Gideon said, before they split into positions. He looked at both brothers. "These men are following orders. Most of them probably don't know what they're following orders for. We disarm, we disable, we remove Eva from the situation. That's all. And if they don't cooperate with disarming?" Julian asked. "Then we make it their idea," Gideon said. The fog came in at 5 in the morning, exactly as it always did, rolling down from the western ridge, pooling in the canyon passage, turning the gray dawn light white and strange. Caleb set the cattle traps at the 2 points Gideon had identified, offset from the trail by enough distance that a horse moving at normal pace would trigger them without injury but with maximum noise and confusion. Julian climbed to the narrow ledge on the south wall of the pass and waited with the rifle across his knees. Gideon stood in the trail. He stood in the middle of it, in the fog, and waited. The wagon came through at 5:30. 6 deputies riding escort Drake had pulled men from the town patrol, which told Caleb, listening from his position, that Drake was nervous about something. Nervous men made the assignment larger than it needed to be. The lead deputy saw Gideon from about 30 feet out and pulled up sharply. "Blackwood." He said it with something between recognition and concern. "You've got a federal warrant on you. Don't make this worse." "How's Gideon making it worse?" Julian's voice came from above them. From the left wall, then immediately from the right, Caleb's doing a trick of canyon acoustics that Julian had used before and that never failed to unsettle people who didn't know what they were hearing. It sounded like there were men on both sides. 2 of the deputies looked up. 2 of them looked behind them. In that moment of divided attention, Caleb triggered the first cattle trap with a length of twine from his position. It went off with a crack of metal and a sound like a dozen boots hitting stone simultaneously. 3 horses spooked. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled disruption, exactly what Gideon had designed it to be. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was thrown. But 3 deputies had their hands full with their animals, and a 4th was looking at the fog to his left, where Julian's voice had appeared to come from, and finding nothing there. Gideon walked forward. He walked through the confusion without hurrying, straight to the wagon. He was pale and moving carefully, and if you knew him well, you could see the cost of it. But he looked like a man taking a Sunday walk. He unlatched the wagon gate. Eva was inside. She was sitting on the bench with her wrists still cuffed, her hair coming loose, her dress dirty from 4 days in a stone cell, and she looked at him and said, "You're pale." "Bullet," he said. "Caleb got it out yesterday." She held up her wrists. He looked at the cuffs, then reached into his coat and produced a set of picks, a skill he'd acquired as a federal scout and had not, until this moment, had occasion to use in front of Eva. He worked quickly, both wrists, and the cuffs fell. She rubbed her wrists, looked at the chaos behind him. Deputies managing spooked horses, fog rolling through the canyon, Julian's voice echoing from impossible angles. "The cattle traps were Caleb's idea," Gideon said. "The canyon acoustics were Julian's," she said. "The plan was mine." "Good plan," she said. He held out his hand. She took it and stepped down from the wagon. The lead deputy, who had gotten his horse under control, looked at Gideon across the fog. He had the expression of a man rapidly revising his understanding of the morning. "Blackwood," he said, "I've got a warrant." "The warrant is based on fabricated evidence filed by a corrupt official," Gideon said. He kept his voice level. "In approximately 10 days, a federal circuit judge is going to hear that case. At that time, Mayor Drake is going to answer questions that he does not want to answer." He looked at the deputy straight. "You can be on the right side of that or the wrong side. That's your call to make." The deputy looked at Eva. Eva looked back at him calmly. The deputy looked at his colleagues, at the ones who'd worked for the previous mayor, who were not making any aggressive moves, who were looking at him with a neutrality that contained information. "I can't stop you," the deputy said finally. It came out like a statement of fact rather than a concession. "No," Gideon agreed. "You can't." Caleb materialized from the fog on the right side of the trail, leading 2 extra horses. He looked at Eva's wrists, already checked the skin, already noted the bruising from the cuffs, with the focused efficiency of a man who had to do his assessment quickly and was making every second count. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I've been sitting in a cell for 4 days," Eva said. "I could run." Julian came down from the ledge. He dropped the last 10 feet and landed light, and when he straightened up and saw Eva standing in the trail, he looked like a man who had just set down something very heavy. He didn't say anything. He crossed the distance and put his arms around her, and Eva pressed her face briefly into his shoulder and breathed. 1 second, 2. Then she stepped back. "We need to move," she said. "I have evidence in my carpet bag. It's in Drake's office." "We know," Julian said. "I have a copy." She stared at him. "You have a—" "I made copies before you left Baltimore," Julian said, "from the letters you brought. I sent them to a lawyer in Cheyenne 2 days ago." He paused. "I thought it was useful to have the documents moving in 2 directions simultaneously." Eva looked at him for a long moment. "Julian," she said. "Yes? You are a remarkable man." He looked quietly pleased and tried not to show it, which was one of his least successful habits. "I know," he said. "Shall we go?" Gideon had already turned his horse toward the far end of the pass. Eva swung up onto the spare horse. The movement was slightly stiff. 4 days of cold and confinement in her joints, but she settled immediately, a rider now, in a way she hadn't been when she'd arrived on the mountain, and brought the horse in alongside him. He was pale. She could see it even in the fog, but his back was straight, and his hands were steady on the reins, and his eyes were scanning the trail ahead, with the alert, methodical habit of a man who had been moving through dangerous country his whole life and had no intention of stopping now. She rode beside him and didn't ask if he was all right, because she could see that he was managing, and asking would have meant acknowledging he needed managing. Behind them, the fog swallowed the pass. Ahead, the trail opened onto the long slope that led back up toward the mountain. Caleb came up on Eva's right side, close enough that their stirrups almost touched, and stayed there. Julian took the rear. They moved through the thinning morning dark, 4 of them on horseback in the Wyoming Territory spring, the canyon walls dropping away behind them, and the open mountains spreading out ahead, and the sun, the actual sun finally, climbing the eastern sky, with the specific golden authority of a morning that has decided to be decent. The sun found them on the high trail and lit them one by one. Eva lifted her face to it. 10 days to the circuit judge. Drake's evidence fabricated and documented. A lawyer in Cheyenne with copies of everything. 3 men who had ridden through a mountain pass in pre-dawn fog to come get her. She had a great deal of work to do. She was ready to do it. The courtroom was not a courtroom at all. It was Oak Haven's largest building, the grain exchange, cleared of its usual inventory and converted in 2 days by the kind of community effort that happens when people have been waiting a long time for something. Benches borrowed from the church, a table brought up from the hotel lobby, a Wyoming territorial flag tacked to the wall behind the judge's chair with more hope than precision. Judge Elias Harmon arrived on the afternoon stage, a thin man of 60 with ink-stained fingers and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by much. He'd been a circuit judge for 11 years. He'd held court in barns, in church basements, in the open air, with a tree stump for a bench. He set his valise down on the borrowed table, looked around the grain exchange, and said nothing, which the assembled crowd correctly understood as satisfaction. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock the following morning. Eva spent that night at Mrs. Greer's hotel. She had a room with a proper bed and a basin of hot water, and no iron door, which she appreciated more than she'd expected to. She sat at the small desk by the window for 2 hours, going through everything Julian had assembled. He'd done thorough work. She'd known he would. But seeing it laid out, the deposition from the Baltimore clerk, the financial records showing payments to the deputy who'd fabricated the original theft report, a letter from a former associate of Drake's that stopped just short of naming him outright, but said enough she felt the full shape of what they were walking into. It was enough. She believed it was enough. She didn't sleep well. She didn't expect to. Gideon knocked at 6 in the morning. She heard him in the hall, the measured weight of his footsteps, the brief pause before he knocked, which was its own kind of courtesy. She opened the door. He was dressed. His color was better than it had been on the trail out of Devil's Pass, which had frightened her more than she'd shown. He was still moving carefully. She could see it in the slight set of his shoulder, the deliberate way he turned, but his eyes were clear, and his jaw was set with the particular resolve she'd come to understand meant he'd already decided how this day was going to go. "How's the wound?" she asked. "Caleb says fine." "That's not what I asked." He almost smiled. "It's manageable." She stepped back to let him in. He came and stood at the window, looking at the street below. Main Street, Oak Haven, on the morning of a federal hearing. People were already moving, gathering in small groups, speaking in low voices. She could see the land office clerk she'd spoken to through Julian. She could see a woman with 2 children, who she recognized from the valley she'd met her at the Holt claim, one of the families Caleb had treated through the winter. "They came," Eva said. "They came," Gideon said. It was a fact that moved through her quietly. These people owed her nothing. She'd been here less than a year. But she'd taught their children, and Caleb had kept their sick alive. And Julian had drawn their portraits and hung them on a wall that said, "You are worth recording," and apparently that meant something to them. She'd known it did. She'd just needed to see the proof. "I want to speak today," she said. Gideon turned from the window. "Eva, I know. Julian's lawyer will do the formal presentation. But Drake is going to stand in that room and characterize our household and our arrangement and who I am. I need to be the one who corrects that." She met his gaze directly. "Not because I don't trust the lawyer, because I want Drake to have to hear it from me, personally." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "You're not going to argue? Would it matter?" She picked up the document folder from the desk. No. He opened the door for her. They went downstairs. The grain exchange filled up fast. By 9:30, there wasn't an empty bench. People were standing along the walls, along the back, outside the door in the spring air. Eva noted this when she came in and kept her expression steady, though something moved through her chest at the sight, the fullness of the room, the presence of so many people who had gotten up on a weekday morning and come. She sat at the petitioner's table with Julian's lawyer, a federal man named Aldous Crane, who had the build of a fence post and the organizational mind of someone who had spent 20 years turning chaos into legal argument. He'd arrived the previous evening on the same stage as Judge Harmon, and he and Eva had spent an hour together going through the documents. He had questions. She had answers. By the end, he'd looked at her and said, "You put this together yourself?" And she'd said yes. And he'd said, "Then this is already won. We're just performing it." Drake sat at the opposing table with his own lawyer, a man who looked expensive and nervous in equal measure. Drake himself did not look nervous. He looked the way he always looked, controlled, polished his silver watch chain catching the light. But Eva had watched him across 2 conversations in an iron cell, and she knew what to look for now. The watch chain moved slightly when he was calculating. He was calculating. Judge Harmon called the room to order with a flat wooden gavel and no theatrical preamble whatsoever. "This is a federal hearing regarding the matter of one Evangeline Mercer, alleged fugitive, currently remanded from Oak Haven County Jail, pending review of the warrant issued in her name." He looked at the room over wire-framed glasses. "This is not a trial. This is a review of evidence and testimony to determine whether the warrant stands. Everyone here will conduct themselves accordingly, or they will leave." "We clear," the room murmured assent. Drake's lawyer went first. He was skilled. Eva gave him that. He laid out the Baltimore charges with the clean efficiency of someone who had organized misleading information into something that sounded like logic. The larceny charge, reframed as embezzlement of school funds. The attempted murder charge, framed as an assault on a city official who had been attempting to investigate her. He used the word inappropriate 3 times in reference to the Blackwood household arrangement, and each time he said it, Eva watched 2 or 3 people in the benches shift uncomfortably. He sat down. Aldous Crane stood up. He was methodical. He introduced the deposition from the Baltimore clerk. First, the man who had witnessed the original charge being fabricated, who had written it in his own hand and signed it. He read 2 passages aloud, speaking slowly and without dramatics, the way you read something when you want the facts to carry the weight themselves. Then the financial records, the payments, names, dates, amounts. Then he looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, we have 9 witnesses prepared to testify to the character and contribution of the petitioner and her household within this community." Drake's lawyer said, "Objection to character witnesses in an evidentiary hearing." "Sustained in part," Judge Harmon said. "I'll hear 2. Choose your best 2, counselor." Crane chose the Holt woman and the land office clerk. Martha Holt stood up, with her baby on her hip, the boy who'd arrived in a rainstorm, red-faced and furious, 3 months ago. And she talked about Caleb in a voice that was completely steady. She talked about what it had meant to have someone who explained things, who washed his hands, who told her what was happening to her own body, instead of just performing procedures on it and expecting her to endure without understanding. She looked at the judge and said, "I don't know about the law, but I know my boy is alive because of this family, and I know what that's worth." The land office clerk was more technical. He talked about the school registry process, about the thoroughness and the legitimate intent behind it, about the children in the valley who were currently receiving an education because Eva Mercer had shown up in Wyoming territory in the middle of a blizzard with her teaching certificates in a carpet bag and her determination entirely intact. Drake's lawyer declined to cross-examine the Holt woman. He cross-examined the clerk briefly. The clerk held up. Then Judge Harmon looked at Eva. "The petitioner wishes to make a statement?" "She does," Crane said. Eva stood. The room was quiet, completely quiet, the way rooms go when everyone in them has stopped moving. She looked at Drake first. She wanted him to know she was going to say this directly to him. "Mayor Drake came to my cell," she said. "He offered to drop the charges. Not because the charges were wrong. He knew they were wrong, He built them wrong on purpose, but because he wanted a confession and compliance in exchange for what he called leniency. She paused. That's not law. That's coercion. And I think most of the people in this room know the difference. She could hear the bench shifting. She moved forward. I left Baltimore because a man with a city seal on his door decided I was something to be managed rather than a person to be respected. He used the legal system as a tool to do it, and he followed me here, across half the country, because the thing he could not tolerate was that I said no. She looked at Judge Harmon now. The charges are fabricated. The documentation proves it. But what I want this court to understand is the purpose behind them. These charges were not about justice. They were about control, and the distinction matter. She sat down. Crane was already on his feet before the echo had settled. He moved to the dismissal motion. Drake's lawyer tried 3 more times. He went after the household arrangement, the immorality angle, the one he'd been saving. He used words like irregular and unlawful and set a dangerous precedent. Gideon stood up. He didn't wait to be recognized. He stood up from the bench where he'd been sitting with Caleb and Julian. And he looked at the judge, and Judge Harmon looked back at him with the expression of a man who has learned to let some things happen, because stopping them would be a waste of everyone's time. Immorality doesn't live in how the 4 of us love and protect each other against harsh winters, Gideon said. His voice carried without effort, low and absolute and clear. It lives in the rotten heart of a man who uses power to crush an innocent woman. Somebody in the back of the room started clapping. It was not dignified, and it was not legal, and it spread through the grain exchange before Judge Harmon could do anything about it. He let it go on for 5 seconds. Then he brought the gavel down twice. I've heard enough, he said. The room quieted. He looked at the documents in front of him, and then he looked at Drake over his glasses. The warrant issued in the matter of Evangeline Mercer is dismissed with prejudice. The fabricated evidence submitted in support of said warrant constitutes fraud upon the court. He looked at his notes. Furthermore, the financial records introduced today raise sufficient questions regarding the conduct of Mayor Harrison Drake that I am ordering a federal investigation into his office to commence immediately. He looked at the 2 federal deputies he'd brought with him from Cheyenne, who were standing against the far wall. Deputies. They moved. Drake stood up. For one moment, just one, the composure cracked. He looked at Eva with something that was no longer cold or calculating. It was raw, and it was ugly, and it told her exactly what it had always been underneath the polished surface. She met his gaze. She didn't look away. Then the deputies had him, and he was turned away from her. And the watch chain caught the light one last time before the door of the grain exchange opened, and he was walked through it. The room exhaled. Eva sat very still. She felt Crane's hand on the table beside hers, a brief, professional acknowledgement. She heard the room begin to move and speak around her. She heard Julian's voice somewhere behind her, saying something she couldn't parse, and Caleb's lower and steadier underneath it. Then Gideon was beside her. He didn't say anything. He sat down in the empty chair next to hers and put his scarred hand palm up on the table between them. She put her hand in his. They sat there while the grain exchange buzzed with the aftermath of justice, and the spring light came through the high windows and lay in long, bright rectangles across the floor. Tommy Ray appeared in front of the table. He'd been brought in by the Holt family that morning, had absolutely refused to stay behind, and now he stood with his coat askew and his eyes wide and his chin lifted at the angle. Eva had come to associate with him, processing something significant. Did we win? He asked. We won, Eva said. He thought about this for a moment. Good, he said. I finished the multiplication tables. Julian started laughing first, then Caleb, then Eva, and she was not entirely sure when it turned into something that wasn't quite laughing anymore. But her face was in her hands, and her shoulders were shaking, and Gideon's hand was still in hers. And outside the grain exchange, the spring sun was burning the last of the winter off Oak Haven's Main Street. It was over. They came back to the mountain in the long light of a May afternoon. The trail up from the valley had changed. Spring had been at work on it, mud drying into solid ground, the brush on either side pushing out new green in every gap and crack, wildflowers, starting at the lower elevation, and then appearing in bursts higher up, the yellow and white and pale purple, of things that had been waiting all winter for their moment. Eva rode behind Gideon and thought about the first time she'd come up this trail, the dark, the snow, the cold that wanted in, the way she'd held the rope and climbed because there was nothing else to do. She'd been a different person then, or maybe not different, more compressed. The cabin appeared through the trees with its familiar amber windows and the smoke coming out of the chimney. Caleb had ridden ahead to open it up, get the fire going, let the cold of the past weeks out and the warmth back in. When Eva walked through the door, the smell hit her, and she stopped in the middle of the room and stood still for a moment. Pine resin, wood smoke, the good smell of somewhere that was hers. She set down her carpet bag, the real one, recovered from Drake's office by Crane's legal authority on the morning after the hearing, and looked around the room. The table where she'd eaten that first night, the iron hooks by the door, the fire Caleb had built up, burning even and low, Julian's sketches on the walls. Tommy's ledger left open on the table to a page of multiplication sums, the last one circled twice in the enthusiastic way. He circled things he was proud of. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly where she'd left it. She went to the fireplace and held her hands toward the heat. Tommy had been deposited with the Holt family for a few more days, his choice, surprisingly, because he and the Holt baby had reached some kind of understanding that nobody fully explained and nobody asked about. He'd told Eva he'd be back on Friday, and Eva had said she'd have the next lesson ready, and he'd looked at her in that way he had of storing information in a place he'd look at later when no one was watching. The four of them had the cabin to themselves. That evening was quiet, deliberately, gradually quiet. The kind that settles over people who have been surviving something intense and are now letting their bodies understand it's over. Gideon sat at the table with a cup of coffee and the territorial map spread open in front of him. Though Eva noticed he wasn't really working. His eyes moved over the maps, but his hands were still. He was just being here. Julian had his sketchbook, but he was drawing slowly, without urgency, the way he drew when the subject was something he wanted to get right and was in no hurry. Caleb cooked. Caleb always cooked when something mattered. Eva had noticed this months ago. It was the thing he did when words were either too much or not enough. He fed people. He made roasted venison with dried rosemary from the jar on the shelf, root vegetables from the winter stores, a pan of cornbread. While he cooked, he moved through the kitchen with the easy competence of someone entirely at home in their own body, and occasionally he'd say something quiet. The temperature was dropping again tonight, he thought, or the Holt boy's color had looked better on the way through, or he'd need to check the mare's left foreleg in the morning. Small things, real things, the ongoing, ordinary text of a life being lived. Eva set the table. 4 places, cups and spoons, the crockery that had chips in it from years of use, and that she'd grown to find more honest than anything new would be. They sat down together. Nobody said grace, Gideon had once told her, when she'd asked that he'd made his peace with whatever was out there a long time ago, in a war he'd rather not detail, and it was more of a working relationship than a reverent one. She'd understood immediately. They ate and talked about ordinary things. The school registry had been officially filed and approved in the aftermath of the hearing. Crane had made sure of it as part of the cleanup, and Julian had the confirmation document in his coat pocket and produced it over supper with the small, careful pride of someone who has accomplished something they'd been working toward for months. Eva read it at the table. Properly certified. Her name, her credentials. An official school to be established in Oak Haven Valley, with books and slates to follow in the fall. We'll need a building, she said. There's a structure down by the Ray claim, Caleb said. Stone walls, sound roof. It was a way station years ago. We could convert it. Tommy would want to help, Julian said. Tommy will try to take credit for the entire thing, Eva said. We'll let him, Gideon said. After supper, Julian washed up without being asked, which was his occasional custom, and which Eva had learned to not comment on, because commenting on it made him stop. Caleb stepped outside to check the horses before dark. Gideon stayed at the table, and Eva stayed too, and they sat across from each other with the fire at her back and the last of the evening light coming through the window. "You all right?" she asked. He turned his cup in his hands. "Ask Caleb." "I'm asking you." He was quiet for a moment. "The wound's healing?" The rest, he'd stopped. "I keep seeing the street. You being walked away. I know. I couldn't." His jaw set. The sentence didn't finish, but she understood it. Gideon had spent years being the person who could handle things, who stepped forward, who didn't fall. Having a bullet in his chest while someone he loved was taken away from him was something that was going to take longer than a courtroom victory to process. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He went still. "You came through Devil's Pass with a bullet wound," she said. "You came, and you got me. That's what happened." He looked at her. "The rest is over," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat there until Caleb came back in, and Julian put away the last of the crockery, and the fire had burned down to a good deep glow. Later, much later, with the mountain dark outside, and the stars out in the way they only get at altitude, more stars than sky, they went down to the river. It was Caleb's idea. He'd mentioned it that afternoon, quietly, not as a plan, but as something the land offered at this time of year. The river ran fast in spring. Snow melt from the higher elevation, but there was a bend downstream where a fallen granite shelf created a natural pool, deep and sheltered, and by May the water temperature was almost bearable. Almost. Caleb had a way of defining almost that Eva had learned to trust. They walked down through the trees in the dark, the four of them, with one lantern that Julian carried. The wildflowers were closed for the night, but you could smell them something sweet and green and clean. The river sound grew, the low rush of moving water over stone, and then they were at the bank. The pool was exactly as Caleb had described, still dark water in the shelter of the granite shelf, the river noise muffled by the stone, stars overhead. The lantern set on a flat rock to one side, casting its small orange light. They went into the water one by one. Eva last, and the cold hit her, and she made a sound she hadn't planned to make, and Julian started laughing, and Caleb told her it would pass in 30 seconds, and Gideon held out his hand from where he stood in the shallows. It passed, and then they were in it together, the cold receding into something clean and total, the river moving around them, the stars above. Eva floated on her back for a moment, with her eyes open, and looked up. The sky was enormous. The sky was the biggest thing she'd ever put herself under. She thought about Baltimore, the narrow rooms, the careful words, the weight of being watched by someone who had decided what she was. It was so far away, not in miles, in everything. Caleb was talking softly, to no one in particular, or to all of them about bioluminescence in rivers, something he'd read about, the tiny organisms that caused it in certain conditions. Whether this river might have them at certain times of year, he'd want to come back and check in midsummer, he said. Julian said he'd sketch it if they found it. Gideon said nothing, which meant he'd be there. Eva said, "I want to bring the children here, as a lesson." "About bioluminescence?" Caleb asked. "About rivers, about the territory, about the fact that understanding something changes how you see it." She righted herself in the water. "Tommy thinks learning is about keeping people from cheating him. I want him to learn. It's also about finding out that the world is bigger than he thought." A silence sat on the water. "You're going to be a very good teacher," Caleb said. "I'm already a good teacher," Eva said. Julian made a sound of agreement that was muffled by the fact that he'd gone briefly underwater. Gideon looked at her from where he stood in the shallows. The lantern light caught one side of his face and left the other in dark and in the river. At night, he looked like something permanent, something carved from the mountain itself. He'd pulled her out of a canyon in a blizzard once. She didn't think she'd ever fully stop being glad of it. She swam to him. He steadied her when she found her footing on the riverbed, his hands at her waist, sure and unhurried. She looked up at him. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying right now. He pulled her close. The river ran around them, and the stars held their positions above. And somewhere in the trees an owl made its one-note inquiry, and the mountain did what mountains do, it stayed. They stayed in the water until the cold won, and then they came out and dried off and walked back through the dark with the lantern swinging, and at the edge of the tree line, Julian stopped and pointed up. "There," he said. High up, where the ridge caught the moonlight, a mule deer stood looking down at them, still as stone. Then it turned and walked away through the silver grass and disappeared into the dark. Julian started to open his sketchbook. "Julian," Eva said. He stopped. "Not tonight," she said. He closed the sketchbook. He looked at the ridge for one more moment, storing it the way he always stored things, carefully, in a place he'd find it again later, and then he turned and followed them home. The cabin was warm when they came back to it. The fire had held. Eva stood in the center of the room and looked at the three of them, damp and cold, flushed and real and alive. All of them, which was not something to take for granted after the past week, and she felt the night fold itself around her like something earned. She went to bed. They followed, and in the dark and the warmth and the quiet of the mountain, all four of them finally fully put down what they'd been carrying. By morning, it was spring, completely, unambiguously, irrevocably spring. 3 years later, the schoolhouse rang with noise. Real noise, the good kind, the kind that means 30 people under the age of 12 are engaged in something and have opinions about it. Eva heard it from 20 yards out, coming through the trees on the trail from the cabin, and she slowed her walk for exactly 1 second to listen to it before she went inside. The old way station had been converted the previous summer. Tommy had helped with every single stage of the process and had claimed primary credit for the foundation stones, which was not strictly accurate, but not entirely untrue either, because he had, in fact, been the one to insist on that particular corner placement. And he had, in fact, been right. The walls were solid stone, the roof sound, the windows real glass ordered from the catalog that had arrived 2 seasons ago. 4 rows of benches, a proper slate board on the east wall, shelves along the north side with the books that had come from Cheyenne and from a donation organized by Julian that had also come, with more fanfare than anyone requested, with a letter from an educational society in New York that had heard about the school through channels nobody fully traced. Julian had framed the letter and hung it on the wall, and not said anything about it, which was the loudest thing he could have done. Eva came through the door, and 32 children looked at her. She'd gained one since the previous week, a girl named Clara, who'd arrived with her family from Nebraska, and had sat in the back row for 3 days, with the expression of someone waiting to decide whether this was worth trusting. This morning, she was in the second row. Eva noted it and let it be. "Good morning," Eva said. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," 32 children said, at approximately the same time, which was as close to unison as she'd ever managed to get them, and which she counted as a victory. Tommy Ray was in the front row. He was 11 now, and he had the particular self-possession of a boy who had spent 3 years being expected to become something and had decided that was fine. He'd outgrown the oversized coat. He'd never outgrown the sharp eyes. When Eva had told him 2 months ago that she wanted to train him to help with the younger students to be a teaching assistant, she'd said, a real one, with responsibilities. He'd looked at the floor for a moment, in the way he still sometimes looked at the floor when something mattered more than he wanted to show. Then he'd said yes. He ran the morning arithmetic now, while Eva took the reading group to the back corner. She could hear him from across the room. His voice had the brisk authority of someone who'd been told He was capable enough times that he'd finally started believing it, and underneath it was something that sounded remarkably like the way Eva herself explained things. The same instinct to understand before you ask understanding of someone else. She didn't say this to him. He'd know soon enough. At noon, she let them out into the spring air, and the noise went from inside to outside, and the valley absorbed it without complaint. She stood in the doorway and watched them and put her hand on her middle, which had recently developed opinions about standing for too long. Caleb had told her 2 months ago. He'd sat down with her at the kitchen table and explained it the way he explained everything completely and directly, covering what she needed to know, answering her questions before she finished asking them. She'd sat and listened, and when he was done, she'd looked at the table for a moment and then looked at him. "All three of you," she'd said. It was a statement, not a question. "All three of us," he'd said. "That's how we've decided to understand it, if you want the same." She'd wanted the same. Gideon had said nothing when she told him. He'd been at the table with his maps. He was working now with the county surveyor's office, his knowledge of the territory proving to be exactly as valuable as any reasonable person might have predicted, and he'd gone still when she said it, and then he'd set down his pencil and looked at her with that gray, steady gaze, and then he'd stood up and crossed the room and held her for a long moment without speaking. When he let go, his eyes were bright. He hadn't acknowledged this, and she hadn't made him. Julian had made her sit for a portrait the same afternoon. She'd asked him why, and he'd said because he wanted to record this specific version of her face, the one she was wearing right now, and she'd asked what version that was. He'd thought about it. "You look like someone who has everything they came here for and is already thinking about what comes next," he'd said. She'd sat for the portrait. It hung now in the cabin, across from the window, where the morning light hit it. Eva in spring. A woman with ink-stained fingers and a direct gaze, and a future she'd built out of a blizzard, and a key placed on a table, and 3 years of choosing. The afternoon lessons were history and geography. Eva stood at the slate board and drew the outline of the United States. From memory she could do it. In under 2 minutes now, the shape of the country becoming something she knew in her hands. And then she drew the trail west. She drew Baltimore, marked it with a dot. She drew the rail lines. She drew Wyoming territory. People moved west for a lot of different reasons, she said. She kept her back to the board, looking at the room. Some came for land, some for gold. Some came running away from something. Some came running toward something. She paused. "What's the difference?" Silence. The children thought about it. She waited, because she'd learned in 12 years of teaching that the thinking was the lesson. Clara, from the second row, said, "When you're running away, you're still letting the thing chase you." Eva looked at her. "Where'd you get that?" Tommy asked. He wasn't dismissive. He was genuinely asking. "My mother said it," Clara said, "when we left Nebraska." Eva turned and added 2 words to the board, "running toward." "That's exactly right," she said. "And it's one of the hardest things there is to do. To stop being defined by what you left and start being defined by what you're building." She looked at the room. "That's what this place is. Everything built here, this school, your family's claims, the whole territory was built by people who made that choice." She let that settle. Tommy was writing something in his ledger. She could see his hand moving fast, the way it moved when he was catching something he didn't want to lose. She went home at 4. The trail from the schoolhouse to the cabin took 20 minutes on foot, longer now than it used to be, though she walked it every day regardless. The spring afternoon was warm and clear, the kind of clear that the territory produced in May after a long winter air that felt cleaned out, light that came down at a low angle and turned every ordinary thing gold. Caleb met her at the edge of the property. He was coming from the direction of the Holt family's claim. He rode over 2 mornings a week. Still, though the boy was 3 and healthy, and the Holt family had expanded to include another baby, and old Mrs. Holt, who'd come from Missouri with opinions about everything, and a constitution that Caleb privately admired. He pulled up his horse and looked down at her. "How's the back?" he asked. "Manageable." He swung down and walked beside her. His medical bag was over his shoulder, smaller than it used to be. He'd reorganized it twice in the past year, as his practice had grown and his methods had refined. He'd been corresponding with a physician in St. Louis who had read the same journals and was running similar experiments with antiseptic technique. They'd been writing for a year. The letters came in every fortnight, and Caleb read them at the kitchen table with the focused attention of someone adding to an ongoing argument he found productive. "Letter from St. Louis today," he said. "What did he say?" "That he's coming west in September. He wants to see the territory." A pause. "And he wants to talk with me about the methods." Eva looked at him. "He used the word colleague," Caleb said. He said it in a way that meant it cost something to say it out loud, because it meant accepting that it was true. "Because you are," she said. He looked ahead at the cabin. "I never went to medical school. You went to the frontier, which is harder." She kept her voice even. "You taught yourself from journals and observation, and from watching what worked when lives depended on it, and you changed how you practice every time you learned something that made the old way worse. That's what a doctor does." She paused. "The ones worth having anyway." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'd have made a very good lawyer." "I know," Eva said. "I chose teaching." The cabin had smoke coming from the chimney, and the sound of voices, Julian's, higher and quicker, and Gideon's underneath it, a counterweight. They were arguing about something. Eva couldn't make out the subject and didn't need to. It was one of those arguments that both of them enjoyed too much to actually resolve. She opened the door. Tommy was at the table. She stopped. He was sitting in his usual chair, in front of his usual ledger, except the ledger was closed, and he was just sitting, and when she came in, he looked up at her with the expression she'd seen on his face twice before. Both times it had preceded something he'd decided mattered enough to say out loud. "I've been thinking," he said. Julian and Gideon's argument had paused. Both of them were watching Tommy, which Tommy was pretending not to notice. "About what?" Eva said. She set her bag on the hook and came to the table. "About what I want to do," Tommy said. "After, when I'm done learning." He looked at the closed ledger, then back at her. "I want to teach." The room was quiet. "The little ones come in not knowing anything," he said. "And then they know things. And you can watch them figure out when they know something the exact second their face changes." He stopped. "I want to do that." He looked at her. "For real, not just helping." Eva sat down across from him. She'd known this for a year. She'd seen it in the way he ran the morning. Arithmetic, the patience he had, with the students who were slower to get it, which was more natural in him than he knew, because it came from remembering what it felt like to not know. She'd seen it in the way he'd leaned over Clara's shoulder on her first day and said, quietly and without any condescension at all, "Just start with the letters you know." She'd been waiting for him to say it himself, because it needed to come from him. "Then that's what you'll do," she said. He held her gaze. "You're not going to tell me I'm too young, or I need to wait, or anything like that." "No." He looked at the ledger, back at her. The chin came up to the angle she knew. "Good," he said, "because I wasn't going to stop anyway." Julian made a sound from across the room. Gideon picked up his coffee and looked at the fire with the specific expression of a man who is trying not to smile, and has been trying not to smile for some time now. Caleb had come in behind Eva. He was at the kitchen. Already she heard the pot on the fire, the particular sound of supper beginning. Eva looked around the room, the table where she'd eaten her first meal in this place, the iron hooks, the fire, Julian's drawings on the walls. There were more of them now, 3 years' worth, portraits and landscapes, and quick sketches that caught things in the life of this household that words would have missed. A sketch of Tommy when he'd learned to write his full name. A sketch of Gideon at the window in winter, looking out at the snow. A sketch of Eva with the Holt baby, just after he arrived in the world, Her face with that expression, Julian had tried to explain and couldn't fully, the one that was too large for a single word. She put her hand on her middle. The child growing there had been made from everything that had built this place. The choice and the work and the winter and the trust. All of it accumulating into something new. Outside, the spring sun was making its way down toward the ridge, and the light it left on the mountain was the particular gold of an evening that has decided to be decent about things. Eva went to the window and stood in it for a moment. The territory stretched out below the valley, the schoolhouse, the ribbon of the river, the trails between homesteads, the whole ordinary, extraordinary life of people choosing to be here. She'd come out of a wrecked stagecoach in a blizzard, with her papers in a bag, and her determination entirely intact. She'd come because a man in Baltimore had decided she was something to be managed, and she'd decided she was not. She'd been right about that. Gideon appeared beside her at the window. He didn't say anything. He stood there looking at the mountain the way he'd been looking at it his whole life, with the attention of a man who understood that it didn't require his opinion, only his presence, and that presence was enough. His hand found hers. The frontier sun came through the window and caught them both. Behind them, Caleb was feeding them, and Julian was drawing something he'd seen in a river 3 years ago and still hadn't gotten exactly right. And Tommy Ray was writing in a ledger, with the handwriting of a future teacher, learning how to make marks that last. The frontier sun may burn away. The weak had heard people say this out here, as though it were a warning or a law of nature. But looking at what had been built here, not by burning away anything, but by choosing and staying and holding on and doing it together, she thought the saying had it wrong. The sun didn't burn away the weak. It just shone brightest on the people who were brave enough to stand in it. She stood in it now. All four of them did. Outside, the mountain held its ground, and the valley spread green and wide, and the schoolhouse stood solid in the late afternoon light, full of the specific noise of children who knew things they hadn't known yesterday. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Eva Mercer didn't come west because she was brave. She came west because she had no other choice, and she made something extraordinary out of that anyway. That's what this story is really about. Not the blizzard. Not the frontier. Not even the four Blackwood brothers standing solid as the mountain they'd built their lives on. It's about what happens when a person decides, quietly, without announcement, without anyone watching, that they are not going to be what someone else needs them to be. That decision, made in a Baltimore classroom doorway by a woman with her teaching certificates in a carpet bag and nothing else, is the moment everything begins. The storm that nearly killed her on the way in was just the territory, confirming what she'd already chosen. There's something the frontier understood that we sometimes forget. Strength isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself. It shows up in a woman who gives herself exactly 60 seconds of fear and then gets to work. It shows up in a man who rides out into a blizzard, 2 hours after a stage goes missing, because he'd made a promise on paper to someone he'd never met, and a promise was a promise. It shows up in a boy named Tommy, who couldn't read his own name when this story started, sitting at a kitchen table 3 years later, telling a room full of people. He's going to be a teacher, and meaning every word of it. Strength in this story is just another word for showing up. For the people who need you, for the life you decided to build. Again and again, in every kind of weather. What Eva found in that cabin, what she built with those 3 brothers, and that boy, and that unforgiving beautiful land, wasn't a rescue. Nobody rescued her. She pulled herself over that embankment. She hauled the surveyor up behind her. She sat across from Gideon at supper, and asked the hard questions, and gave the honest answers, and chose every single day to stay. What she found was something rarer than rescue. She found people who were willing to be known, and she let them know her back. That's the gift this kind of story offers us. Not escape, not fantasy, something more useful than either of those things. A reminder that the life worth having is almost never the life you planned for. That the people who change you most are sometimes the ones who show up holding a rope in a blizzard and don't make a speech about it. That home isn't a place you come from, it's a thing you build, board by board, season by season, with whoever is willing to pick up a hammer and stay. The frontier sun doesn't burn away the weak. It shines brightest on the people brave enough to stand in it. Eva stood in it, and at the end, so did everyone she loved. That's the story. And if it stayed with you, if some part of it felt true in a way that has nothing to do with 1,880 or Wyoming or mail-order marriages, then it did exactly what a good story is supposed to do. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations portrayed in this narrative are entirely fictional and created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The historical setting and frontier details are used as a creative backdrop and are not intended as a precise historical account. Viewer discretion is advised for themes including survival, frontier hardship, and emotional subject matter.